He has a big target. I believe he has to invest 5 billion into New Zealand startups.
My second day in New Zealand, Peter Jackson came on and we started to record the soundtrack from the second Lord of the Rings film. You don't build nuclear fusion with a couple of $1 million. You're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars taking rockets to space. New Zealand has the second highest number of launches of rockets in the world. Cheap drones wiping out multi-million-dollar airplanes and things. Technology is hugely disruptive in military warfare, but there's huge beasts of machinery sort of behind the incumbents as well. It seems like a small country like New Zealand, there's no reason why it couldn't be producing cheap, disruptive warfare.
Just go and do it and see what happens.
Ideas are worth like jack shit, absolute jack shit. Like if you can't execute, there's nothing.
Just take that initiative to actually take whatever crazy ideas that they might have and just try to see what comes of it.
Don't be afraid of ambition. Chase it, love it, wrap your arms around it and say it out loud.
New Zealanders don't know any better. They will just get up and give it a shot. That's why we were first to get to the top of Mount Everest.
Go to dream that ultimate dream. Like, what is it that you ultimately want to do? And it's all achievable.
All right. So today we aren't talking to a founder. We're talking to the architect, the New Zealand startup ecosystem funding environment, and the guy who controls the single biggest lever in the New Zealand startup ecosystem.
Yeah, that's right. We have James Pinner with us. He's the Chief Investment Officer of NZGCP, that's New Zealand Growth Capital Partners. He manages, or he's responsible for the Aspire Fund and the Elevate Fund, and we're going to go into the details there. But basically, if you are a VC in New Zealand, you need to know James and you need to be well connected to James.
James isn't kind of the typical government official. He spent 15 years in London's cutthroat capital markets and then another 5 years managing the dynastic wealth of Todd Corporation. So he knows the difference between a 10-year deep tech play and just a science project that goes nowhere.
Yeah, and he has a big target. I believe he has to invest 5 billion into New Zealand startups in the next years. So we're going to talk about what that means for the New Zealand ecosystem. But we will also find out why he thinks that KiwiSaver is the sleeping giant that needs to wake up.
All right, let's dive in.
Yeah, let's do it.
Well, hope we didn't oversell you, James.
No, thanks for the introduction. Great to be here, guys. In my background, I'm from the UK originally. I came over here to New Zealand about 25 years ago, met my first wife. I always thought then that New Zealand had a great opportunity to have a great startup ecosystem. It's a small country a long way away from most Western markets, but at the same time, we've got some great entrepreneurs. We've always seen over the years some great startups coming up. Back then it was sort of Trade Me and Zero. Now it's more sort of Rocket Lab and Partleys and all these other companies and Halters that are sort of going. So we've got the bones, we've got the the important bit, we've got the entrepreneurs, and we've got the people who are sort of can walk the walk and can execute these deals. I went was back in London for another 10 years after being here the first time, and my background is more in finance background. So as you mentioned, I've worked in capital markets in London. Also spent a while time working in films. A lot of financing of some of the first Harry Potter films and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and working with Pinewood Studios. So that was pretty cool. And then I went and worked in the telecom, media, and TMT kind of sector. Did a lot of work for Nokia back then, trying to build their empire just until the iPhone came out and took them a bit of a sideswipe. So that was fun times. And then eventually sort of came back to New Zealand. As you mentioned, worked for the Todd family. Interesting times, looking globally, and all sorts of big conglomerate, really looking at everything from we had Parts Trader was one of their investments in the tech side, through to wine, through to mining and oil and gas. It was interesting.
Yeah.
Half years ago, I got the opportunity to join NZGCP, and we can talk about
that. Here we are. Yeah, and I wanted to double click on your role at Todd Corporation. For those who don't know, it's a multi-generational kind of family office. They've been in business for over 150 years. How did that time kind of shape your view on long-term venture capital success versus, short-term gains that you might have kind of worked on in your time in London?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, like you say, the Todd family is sort of two businesses. It's the corporation, which is the main businesses, and then there's a separate family office that looks after the family's well. It's interesting. It's pivoted since, I think it was 1884 it sort of started off providing skill services to the sheep industry, then the car industry, then got into oil and gas. And
James, 1884. Wasn't that around the time that the first settlers, or not the first settlers, but like a lot of the settlers came to New Zealand?
Yeah, it would have been certainly sort of when more the bigger influx of especially British people were coming over. The sheep farming industry was growing, I think, at the time, and presumably gold as well at the time. Yeah, so they were servicing that and providing a lot of the tools and machinery to them. Then started getting into cars and importing kit set cars to manufacture. Then petrol stations were the natural thing after that, and then eventually, hit oil and gas in. I think the first sort of oil wells first licenses were in the late 50s. And then sort of kept on expanding. And so it is interesting. Yeah, sort of it's an old company, but has transformed a lot over those years. So it's had to innovate in terms of what it's been doing. And I think that's, true of any large corporation that's available alive now. And, and again, we look at venture, and it isn't, well, certainly in our portfolio, it's certainly not a short-term gain. It's about long-term value creation. A lot of our companies take sort of 14 plus years. We're a very early investor, and we'll get into that in a second. But, you are building multi-generational businesses, hopefully, and that's what you're aiming for. It's not about a quick return. It's not about where private equity is more of a sort of 3 to 5 year timeline. We are looking to build huge businesses and back huge businesses.
And did that change? Because I assume, your work in London was again focused on sort of shorter term gains, moving to Todd. It's like you're looking at whatever, 10, 20, 50 years. Did that change your perspective and the types of assets you considered and looked at? And if so, how?
I guess yes and no. I've always loved tech, and I've always loved innovation, however formed. Like I mentioned, I sort of worked in TMT in London as well. So some of that was long term sort of corporate building. We were working with bigger clients like Vodafone and Nokia at the time. But my first startup was I started working on was 25 years ago. It was a precursor to Airbnb, where literally the company was supplying computers to B&Bs because it was such a long time ago. But it always fascinated me. It was, financial engineering and all those kind of things. Yes, you can make money out of them, but it's not interesting, is it? It's not as cool as, seeing a company grow, a company transform people's lives and do really cool stuff, to be honest. I think with my financial background, private equity is probably, a natural skill set, but it just doesn't interest me. I'd rather be seeing things, being able to say, we backed a company at the early stages and now look at them now, 10, 20 years later. It's pretty fascinating. I looked at one company, it was 2006 or so. They brought in the first prototype of this tablet that you could swallow, and as it went through your intestines, it would open up and X-ray you from the inside and do a colonoscopy.
That's really cool. You mentioned you got into some film financing as well. What was that like?
Fascinating. It was sort of heavily involved, sort of more from the tax side. So we were having to sort of verify they were spending enough money in the UK, which meant going through actors' contracts and how money was spent, especially on SFX and VFX. But you were spending a lot of time on set, especially Harry Potter, which was one of the few films that was set up with had an intention of making 6-7 films. So they had a permanent studio. The main dining hall was a permanent feature. And so you just got to spend a lot of time sort of running around stages and seeing all the actors, all the young kids as they were at the time on the Harry Potter films. It's quite amazing sort of being behind the scenes. And actually one of the things that's sort of massively underappreciated is things like the carpentry and the woodwork and all those kind of things that go into building these what look like slimy sewers and things like that. There's a hell of a lot of craftsmanship that goes on behind that, as well as obviously all the visual effects and things. So
right. And you get to see that at Hobbiton, right?
Well, actually, and also my second day in New Zealand, when I came the first time, I went to a cricket match, and Peter Jackson came on at a half time, and we started to record the soundtrack. Well, some of the scenes from the second Lord of the Rings film. So again, sort of that was my a great introduction to New Zealand and got me hooked.
Oh, that's cool. What made you interested in New Zealand? Like just you personally? It's obviously coming from London. It's very fast-paced, exciting, large AUMs, large ticket sizes, big opportunities globally, to New Zealand, which at the time that you came was actually fairly.
Yeah. It was more by accident, actually. I hate to admit it, but I was doing like a lot of New Zealanders do. Sort of decided after graduating and having a couple of years of work, I'd do my OE. So I decided to move to Sydney, and pretty much as far away as I could get from London. And then realistically, I found out I was sort of hanging out with a lot of English people doing quite English things in a slightly hotter climate. And someone recommended that if I wanted to do something different, more outdoorsy, and I sort of, I love the outdoors, try New Zealand. So literally hopped on a plane the next day, ended up in Wellington, and kind of, like I said, the second day, being filming part of the soundtrack for Peter Jackson, and the rest is history. But it's an interesting point. So I'll just sort of, like you say, New Zealand is a small country. I'm coming from the UK. It's now 75 million people. New Zealand back then was more like 3 million people, and I think something like 60 million sheep. It isn't somewhere you naturally think is going to have opportunities for doing cool stuff, and then coming back sort of 10 years later when my kids were sort of school age and wanted to bring them up in New Zealand, you sort of fear like, oh, what will the opportunities be? And this is the one thing I really sort of struggle with is New Zealand has such amazing startups, amazing companies that the general public don't know about. We're seeing like I was on a trip last week and we're seeing Dawn Aerospace doing hypersonic rockets, nuclear fusion going on in Wellington. There's amazing things going on and hiring hundreds of people, and most people don't know about it, even in New Zealand, let alone around the world.
When we talk a lot about the number 8 wire mentality in New Zealand, the ability to sort of, for Kiwis to, fix anything with a piece of wire and ingenuity. And you've said this target of 5 billion in investments over the next 5 years. And I kind of wonder, does that number 8 wire mentality, is actually a liability when we're talking about deploying billions of dollars and scaling big companies? Do you feel like that needs to change in the culture of New Zealand entrepreneurs?
I'm not sure it's entrepreneurs. It may be a little bit. Like I've seen over the years, ambition has perhaps been one of the limiting factors in New Zealand. We haven't been as ambitious. And we do have this we kind of excuse our companies don't need much money because we're really good at being lean and mean, and we can do things on a purse string. But you're right. I think that has to shift. I was talking to a third-time founder from the US last week, and he's raising, US $15 million as a seed round. And he can go so much faster and so much quicker than any New Zealand startup can. Yes, we'll get there eventually, but in an increasingly competitive world, limiting the amount of capital that we have and having that mindset that having not very much capital is the best way. Yes, of course, there are benefits to them. We've seen, massively overinflated rounds and what can go wrong there as well. And same with VC funds, but it has to be a balance. We have to continue to be ambitious. We have to continue to be, we want to compete on a global scale. You don't build nuclear fusion with a couple of $1 million. You're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Taking rockets to space, it's the same, So we do need to change our mind shift, but we also need to change the amount of capital that's available because at the moment we are hamstrung by, how much capital is available. It's all very well me saying we need to deploy 5 billion over the next 5 years, but if that's all reliant on high net worth individuals, which it is now, we're not going to get there.
Yeah. Well, and I would maybe double click on that a little bit, and I would ask, is that true for every industry? Because I know for deep tech and biology and biotech and those kinds of industries where there's regulatory hurdles and there's specialized knowledge that needs to be kind of like applied to a physical substrate, you need people. For software, we're seeing now you can build any piece of software really from your bedroom in a weekend with the tools that exist today. And for those kinds of opportunities and things, I don't know if you need a ton of capital. In fact, like the capital might actually force you to think I need to hire a lot of people when actually what you need to do is just create better agentic AI products that maybe don't need all those people to run. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think AI is going to be the exception. I think, well, maybe not the exception, but it certainly is different to how it has been. I've seen people predicting that, you're going to see the first $1 billion, $1 trillion companies with handfuls of people as opposed to the hundreds of thousands that, say, Google's got. Yes, deep tech is always going to be harder. Traditionally, software, again, it's always seen as sort of capital efficient at the beginning, but to win those markets, it then becomes quite capital intensive. AI may be that one trend. We've certainly seen, some of the acceleration of some of those customer acquisition. People are bootstrapping for a lot longer and actually having not needing to raise money for way longer than traditional and normal software business.
Yeah, and maybe to double click on what you said about how to deploy the 5 billion. I think you said publicly that we are funding too many companies for too long and that we need to concentrate more capital in the winners. Do you think that New Zealand has a kind of zombie startup problem? And should we be quicker in trying something, failing, and then trying something again?
Yes, and short. I think there's two elements to it. I think one of the things we talk about is 5,000 startups. So really what I'm talking there is sort of around about 1,000 new startups a year. So those number 5,000 startups is based on global averages. So you look at any sort of population, it's generally about 1,000 startups per million population. So you go to Victoria, Australia, or Ireland, or Singapore. These are the kind of numbers we're talking. But that is generally sort of presupposed on sort of like 1,000 startups, and half of them fail, or 40% fall each sort of round, and they drop off quite quickly. Whereas in New Zealand, we have historically, New Zealanders are very nice people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think in terms of startups, sometimes we do. Well, we do. We let companies, we keep funding them for a little bit too long. Generally, if you think about sort of, if a company fails in the US, generally that founder is going, okay, I'll just brush myself off and I'll get on to the next one. And they've learned so much from that. And investors are looking at those serial founders who've done it 2-3 times. Hopefully they've had some successes along the way, is even better. But even if you haven't, you've learned so much. But we're not allowing that recycling of talent. Those people that have been on that 10-year journey because we've kept the startup going, and it's, like you say, sort of become a zombie sort of startup. Those people could be working for that next generation of startups, or creating that next generation of startups and helping those accelerate even quicker. We saw, especially over the last 2021 onwards, 21 to 23, especially in New Zealand, a lot of companies, a lot of the money going was on to follow-on investments. It wasn't going into new companies. The people were willing to take those risks. And therefore, there was a sort of a lull of new and exciting companies going forward, and people trying to preserve what's there. But we've all got limited cash. I'd love to have unlimited capital to be able to deploy into lots and lots of companies. But you have to think about the opportunity cost at all times. And if you're funding that one, which is, just sort of easing along, you'll always get it wrong. We always get it wrong. And that'll be like one of those companies you pulled the pin on, it could have been successful. But at the same time, you look at the opportunity cost of, pulling that money into an early stage company that's going to go on and become really successful. I think we've got to be mindful of that all the time.
Yeah.
VC maths as well as I do. When in your own portfolio, you've got to be concentrating into the winners, because that's it is a power law game.
When you say that, are you saying that just from like a gut feel, or are there actually numbers to support the fact that New Zealand, funds a lot more existing companies versus new companies compared to like Silicon Valley or something?
Yeah, there certainly are stats around how long we take to get to certain levels of revenue and levels of, Series A rounds and things like that. So we are generally taking quite a lot longer. Part of that is obviously is the lack of capital. So we can't, throw resource to build teams and go quicker. But I think it's an element of, we are keeping the average length for duration of companies is a lot longer.
Makes sense. Okay. You mentioned earlier that 5 billion number is unattainable unless you get new sources of capital, right? And I think there are billions sitting in KiwiSaver, and most of that is invested into Australian banks and the S&P 500. I think it would make a lot of sense to invest some of that into your fund, NZGCP, and into other funds and funds of funds, and basically channel some of that money into growing our local ecosystem, because that would just give dividends all the way through, right? So why is it so hard to get New Zealanders to do that? What's the problem?
Yeah, look, and I think there's different funds. Obviously, one of our funds is our direct fund is a very, very high risk fund. That's why we exist, is because we take the higher risk, before the private investors generally want to come in. But yeah, certainly, like venture capital is an asset class that's been proven around the world. It is still young in New Zealand, so I couldn't hand on heart say, there are 10, 20 funds with proven track records in New Zealand that you should definitely put in. Whereas in the US, you've got 4,000 VC funds to choose from. You can be picking the top 10%, or top quartile. So it is still immature. But at the same time, what I struggle with the most is that we've got, I think it's about $120 billion in KiwiSaver at the moment. Globally, when you talk to pension funds, they have a balance. They're in equities, they're bonds. They're also in what we call alternative assets, property, infrastructure, private equity, and VCs, kind of the highest risk. Because they do give different types of returns over long periods. In New Zealand, the KiwiSavers, most of them, and there are exceptions, and I great, and we want to keep supporting the ones that are doing things differently. But most of them are below 3% in alternatives, full stop. I think 3% is actually the highest of any KiwiSaver, whereas globally that's more like 15 to 20%. Some of the best endowment funds in the US, you look at Yale and Harvard and Stanford, they've been 30 to 40% in alternatives, and a lot of that in VC. So at the moment, a lot of the money is going to public equities, and until we get some, there's more of a balanced sort of portfolio, then it's going to be hard to see them coming into VC, which will be, we need to prove up the asset class. But you're right, there's plenty, a tiny, small allocation of that 120 billion, 1% of that is, seismic shift in sort of the amount of money going into New Zealand. 5%, as we said, is, that's $6 billion there, which would transform the New Zealand market. Then you've got, NZ Super and ACC, which is another 150 billion plus. Plus, then you've got corporate venture, which is pretty rare in New Zealand. You've got iwis looking to sort of invest in the space. So there's huge opportunities there. But at the same time, we have to be honest. We haven't got a proven track record yet as an asset class in New Zealand that we should be encouraging everyone to do it. But certainly, I think as a part of a balanced portfolio, it does make sense to and have again, you should be investing in a portfolio of either companies or funds, depending on what you're looking, because it is a risky asset class, but there's huge potential there.
But James, I mean, I would also push back on that a little bit, right? Like whenever I'm sure you've pitched all these guys and you've explained why they should be investing into your fund of funds or into individual VC funds. I mean, there have been exits in New Zealand, right? And there've been a lot of exits. A lot of exits have returned a lot of money. So when you say it's not a proven asset class, what do you mean?
So if I was an institutional investor like a pension fund, what I'd probably be looking at investing in maybe say 10 plus funds. So running a sort of balanced portfolio of 10 different VC funds. At the moment, there aren't 10 New Zealand VC funds with proven distributed returns, sort of, with a track record of multiple vintages of doing so. And so I think at the moment we're probably a little bit. We'll get there. Don't get me wrong. I think I'm very confident we will be there in sort of 5-10 years. And there are balance. You could invest some into some Australian funds and some New Zealand funds, but also, you can pick some VC funds individually who have got track records or emerging managers, and we've seen globally that emerging managers often outperform established managers. So there is definitely room to invest in these spaces, especially if you're talking a relatively small portion of your portfolio. I think that sort of balanced risk appetite is worthwhile.
That makes sense. Whenever you think about like VC, when you look at funds globally, I think I remember seeing some statistic like 75% of funds globally don't even return 1x, right? And even if you look at like a bunch of funds, like a bunch of vintages in a certain fund, the returns could be all over the place. Maybe a certain Sequoia fund is actually really good, but a certain Sequoia fund is just average. And so on net, you build a brand, and like on net, maybe you return more than you've gotten invested, but that can vary. And so when you think about that, right? And again, thinking of you as like pitching this idea to the KiwiSaver or NZ Super, like, how do you explain that? Do you just say, look, it's all about the managers, and if the manager, like, we're betting on the managers, and like sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but on net, it's betting on kind of like the jockey basically, or is it like, or is there something else like you have to kind of sell to them?
One, with a lot of sort of institutional investors, it's the asset class itself. So what does the average return of a fund manager in that jurisdiction return? And you're absolutely right. So the average fund manager in the US probably does return less than one. So then in America, you're picking, okay, I need to pick the top 25% at least, and then I've got a good chance of getting returns. At the same time, there is a chance that any single manager returns a zero. So it's a power law game, high risk. Every single one of them could go to zero. So as an institutional investor, I want a portfolio now of funds. So one, I've got an asset class or a portion of the asset class which averages to at least X, if not higher, ideally higher, and benchmark of returns for the risk. And then on that, then I'm selecting within that the best managers and a portfolio of them to again balance my risk. So that's how I would sort of, from an institutional point of view. And it depends. NZ Super is an $85 billion fund. They have access to global markets now. They're also so big that their minimum check size is probably bigger than most New Zealand funds in New Zealand at the moment. So they have they have a nice problem to solve. They've got global markets to be able to choose from. But also I think from sort of KiwiSaver point of view, there is huge opportunity to do good for New Zealand. You've got you don't have to take huge amounts of risk in your portfolio, but the impact you could have and the circularity of sort of the benefits of that, because they are funding the next generation of New Zealand future businesses, the future sort of economy leaders of this country. Rocket Lab is now a multi-billion-dollar business. There'll be plenty more of those as we go through.
Yeah. Well, speaking of risk and risky investments and portfolio strategy, you've shifted the Aspire fund to invest even earlier, pre-Series A in a lot of cases. And a lot of critics say, the private markets are not investing here and you're investing. Are you investing because the opportunity is big, or because the private angels are too risk averse, or are you maybe misallocating funds because if there's no private investment, maybe there's something wrong with the company? But what is your kind of like philosophy on that?
So it goes to what we call it intervention logic. So why is government even involved in this space? And for us, we've got two elements. And you're talking about our direct fund, which is called the Aspire Seed Fund. That exists and to essentially fill gaps where things are too risky for private investors. Now, a lot of people sort of think government, they shouldn't be investing in that risky stuff. That's exactly what we should do. And we should be the highest risk takers in the market. We go there to help those early stage companies take that risk, get to the next stage, slightly de-risk, and then people like you guys come in and say, okay, now that risk reward is in my sort of wheelhouse, and we can seed more and more companies. So as a government, we fund science and research and innovation for the public benefit to create, and a lot of commercializations hopefully going to come out of that. We fund grants, so certain projects and R&D projects we happily fund, and this is just an extension of that. We are investing into that early stage of those companies that have formed, and providing them the financial support to, as I said, to get to the point where then private investors can step in. We do it alongside private investors. We have a minimum requirement of 1-to-1 matching capital, so we always require someone. And at that early stage, it's generally more like a sort of, like I said, an angel investor who's willing to take a bit of risk in their own private capital. And then we follow on. So where there's a sort of combination of sort of where we see the biggest capital gaps, and in New Zealand at the moment, that's more on the deep tech side of things. We then follow on to support those companies alongside private investors as well. And then we'll step out as soon as there's enough sort of private capital.
Makes sense. Yeah. And actually, maybe, I can speak to what industries you think are interesting and exciting in New Zealand right now. I mean, I think, as I alluded to earlier, I think software is really, it's really easy to build now, which makes it much harder to be defensible. What do you think about deep tech? Is that kind of the area that New Zealand is really good at, or is it AgTech? What are your thoughts, and what is your perspective about the market as a whole, and what can New Zealand really excel at?
Interesting question. Space is an obvious one for me. And if you'd asked me this 20 years ago, I'd have said, no, why? It doesn't make sense. But we actually had, and I was just talking to a few sort of space companies recently. We have, and aeronautical companies, we have an amazing regulatory environment to launch and test space rockets and airplanes and things. And that is now, with the benefit of Rocket Lab, you're now seeing spin-offs from Rocket Lab coming, employees of Rocket Lab setting up their businesses and so on, and that's spinning off. And New Zealand has the second highest number of launches of rockets in the world. That's crazy.
Yeah.
For 5 minutes.
Rocket Lab's the second biggest satellite launch provider in the world. Yeah, after SpaceX.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it's a global name now, which is great. So space is one. Space and I'd say aeronautics generally. I think there's lots of opportunities that are coming, and we're seeing things from, like we mentioned Dawn earlier, Zeno, Newton, all sorts of different space industry. It's really hard at the moment to fund these things, especially everyone's in the US is focusing a lot on AI and a lot of the money's going there. So we are having to see these things being funded for a bit longer, but I think New Zealand has some great innovation there. Industrial cleantech is one I'm really excited about. I think we've seen over the last few years, you've got New Zealand technology being used to recycle or clear up sort of waste products from large industrial products. You've got aquaforestry, wastewater. You've got zinc recovering zinc from iron ore furnaces and innovation, etc. So there's lots of those kind of things going on. Software, yes, we've always been good at software. AI, I'm not so sure at this stage. I think my pretty strong view is we're behind the curve on that. I'm not sure partly that is New Zealand's humbleness of not trying to define a company as AI, whereas I guess I'm sure in the US everything would be AI.
Everything's AI. Everything.
Yeah,
Absolutely everything. The laundry store down the street is
Yeah, exactly.
But James, maybe to double click on that, because you mentioned earlier that you see the mandate of NZGCP to kind of absorb the market failure of going in these super risky early stages. In terms of industry, do you see it similarly that NZGCP should actually probably be very active in AI because the market is not able to fund it for whatever reason? Or do you think that there's like space, which is a big opportunity and that's where it should be? Or is it both?
It's a bit of both. I guess our mandate isn't to create companies. So we can only really invest in what we see. And we haven't seen a lot of AI companies. So we have invested in a couple that we've seen. Yeah, it's always a challenge with government of picking winners and trying to understand what would be useful. In some degrees, that's what our science system's trying to do. We're trying to think about missions we want to solve. So what are the big global impact issues, or what are the few big future trends we're trying to solve, like AI and quantum and things like that. But at the same time, you want to double down on what you can see in front of you if it's working. So space is one area where I don't think we have a lot of foresight. Rocket Lab came and we knew as a country that was going to happen. But now we've seen all the spin-offs. We've got to double down on that and keep backing it. So it's tricky. It's a bit of both, I think. You've got to be, as my friend Randy Commissar will always say, you've got to make your luck. You've got to give yourself the best ingredients and opportunities to be lucky. So I think that's what we've got to keep doing. And then once you get it, make sure you look at it, make sure you jump on it.
Yeah. Why medical device? I mean, so with Rocket Lab, right? I think the founder of Rocket Lab, he just was a very strong-willed individual, is the story that I kind of understood. And kind of made this company happen against every single kind of resistance you could find, right? And he persevered through that. Why medical devices and why clean tech? Is that a little bit just kind of arbitrary and it just so happened? Or is there, like, for example, with the aerospace and the Rocket Lab, right? I think because of, as it grew, I think New Zealand actually changed regulation to accommodate it, right? Which then empowered more companies. But with medical stuff, I mean, New Zealand does have fairly lax clinical testing, clinical trials, regulations compared to the US, compared to the FDA rules you have to go through. We have one of our companies actually doing clinical trials in New Zealand because of that. So I guess, is some of that regulatory or some of that just sort of arbitrary? And the founder just happened to be born in New Zealand and started this company because he really believed in it?
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer. I think there's an element of, we're a clean green country, so sort of clean tech is there, and we naturally don't lean ourselves to, because we're sort of 90% renewables, we don't lean ourselves to sort of energy innovation. It's more other things that are sort of clean. Medical devices, again, it's, there's Fisher and Paykel healthcare, and there's a bit of a history there. So maybe it's partly out of that as well. We are a very strong engineering country. So I think that's sort of where we're applying those engineering mindsets to solving medical problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to pin down, really.
What about AgTech? What do you think about AgTech? You didn't mention that.
I have a slightly controversial, I don't know if it's controversial. I don't think we have a strong AgTech potential in New Zealand, partly because we're a pastoral farming, so we rely on grass farming, and really the only other countries that do that are Ireland, Chile, and a few other sort of places in South America. So most of the innovation we create isn't globally scalable on a venture sort of scale. So as opposed to, if you're selling into a sort of corn-based model like the US. The other side of it is we have very fragmented sort of farm ownership, which means that sort of getting concentration of product and solutions out there, it means there's very disaggregated solutions and point solutions. So I think both of those for me lean towards, we don't actually see a lot of venture scale ag tech.
Because structurally the market in New Zealand is so different from the global market that it's hard to scale innovation.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's a very interesting perspective.
We are amazing farmers, don't get me wrong. We have great technology in farming and competitive advantage on producing grass-fed beef, but that doesn't mean we have amazing ag tech, which is venture scalable.
Now, how do you explain? I mean, but aren't there certain applications and problems that all farmers face, which I guess Halter maybe proves that there's certain applications that regardless of how you're doing your farming, you still need to solve?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, like there'll always be, and that's a good point to prove me wrong. I think there's always going to be exceptions. And, you look at Zespri and the, kiwi fruit innovation as well. It's another huge global innovation that's done really well. I must admit, we don't see as much sort of global scalable ag tech. I think for those structural reasons, like you're right, like something which can apply to cows globally and other ruminants will obviously have a big market.
James, what's your kind of timeline when you think about investments? I mean, in VC, we typically think about kind of 10 years as like the horizon in which we need to return capital. Do you have a slightly longer view as kind of a government entity? And how does that change maybe with AI and other technologies?
Yeah, we invest at the early stages. So generally we're looking 13, 14 years probably to an exit. One of our biggest exit we had about 2 years ago was Cami, and that was a software education company, but that was a 14-year sort of first investment to exit. I think Yeah, hopefully we will see as New Zealand companies get better accelerated, funded, and can accelerate some of those timelines. Those times compress. I think you're right. If we software and AI, we generally expect to be a lot quicker than that. Actually, it was interesting looking at some presentations. I think it was Anderson Horowitz last week, looking at the timelines from sort of deep tech of investment through to exit in Europe and America, both really compressed. They're sort of getting below 5 years in some places. We are sort of, in a way, we are reliant on exits to be able to reinvest. So we are definitely reliant on those exits, but at the same time, we are taking a long-term view of we're trying to create economic impact for the benefit of New Zealand. So recycling that money as quickly as possible is definitely sort of lower down on our priority list.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And, so you're a fund of funds, and so you're sort of the kingmaker in a lot of ways. Like, if you had a magic wand and you could create a new VC fund in New Zealand tomorrow, that doesn't exist yet, what would it focus on, and like where do you think is the white space and opportunity?
That's an interesting question. I think, to be honest, we've got a lot of funds across all stages now. So we have got a lot of sort of earlier stage funds all the way through to bit later stage in New Zealand's probably used to. It'd be nice to have like a sort of US Series B plus sort of fund in New Zealand, because we are entirely reliant, and I think, to be honest, we probably always will be relying on overseas investors for that later stage growth capital. I think, we do sort of struggle with scale a bit, and a lot of the funds are still sort of around that sort of 50 million mark, and ultimately, I think to get to the 5,000 startups, we are going to need to see $200-300 million funds quite regularly, and probably more like 20 or 30 of them, as opposed to at the moment we've had one or two. So I think it's really about scaling and sort of bringing that sort of professionalism to those funds rather than any particular sort of asset class or any particular sector sort of focus. And again, this is one of those tricky ones where at the moment, with the size of New Zealand, is a specialist fund versus a generalist fund sort of the right approach? And we've seen, a broad range of sort of generalist deep tech and generalist across the market, or generalist software. We've seen a little bit of sort of speciality and maybe fintech and things, but we haven't seen sort of super niche focused funds. And I think that's probably appropriate for the size of the market at this stage. But as the market grows, you do see, like I said, the US is a much more evolved market. So you see funds by stage of investment versus sector as well. So we'll get there, I think, eventually.
Who's your who do you look up to? I mean, I guess as you sort of have this double mandate of growing the fund, but also growing the ecosystem, like returning your capital, but also like building this ecosystem, right? Who do you look up to? Are there countries or funds or sovereign wealth funds that have done a really good job that you look up to?
I'd say the top three. I was lucky to spend a bit of time with two of them last year. Is Enterprise Ireland, 5 million population, very reliant on primary industries historically, and they have grown to pretty much 5,000 startups. They've got real sort of they for other reasons they're close to Europe and so on. So they've got a whole mature tech sector as well as a growing startup ecosystem. But they have a really joined up way of doing that, and some great models that we want to replicate. Australia and Victoria in particular, so Launch Vic and Breakthrough, they've both done some great things. They've got a slightly more scale than us, but at the same time they've got 5 million people and got to 4,000 or 5,000 startups. And then Singapore again, they've put a lot of money behind and a long-term commitment to doing this. And so I think what's great is we can sort of pick and choose some of the best approaches that we've seen overseas, and we've got proven track records of what does and what doesn't work. So we're not just sort of blindly sort of taking ideas. And what's been amazing is each one of them has been incredibly willing to collaborate with us and wants to build bridges between New Zealand and Singapore and Australia and Ireland. They're the kind of similar size economies or sort of jurisdictions that I think have just a bit more mature than where we are, so we can look ahead. A bit like a founder, you can look at another startup who's a couple of years ahead in the journey and say, okay, well, what can I learn from that?
Yeah. Speaking to that, kind of ecosystem of countries, even small countries collaborating, we're kind of now living through this very, some ways disturbing, some ways interesting to observe time where the global order is changing. The U.S. is stepping back. The Canadian Prime Minister had that speech at Davos about the geopolitical alliances shifting. And New Zealand is at a very interesting place where it's part of the Five Eyes. It's English speaking. It's very very clearly in the Western camp, but its biggest trading partner is China, right? Kind of has to like strike that balance very carefully of shifting alliances. How do you think about what that means for startups and funds? Does that mean that startups and funds, and maybe even as a government organization, do you need to think about, hey, maybe we should be focusing on the smaller countries, even maybe US is the biggest market, but actually if it's an unreliable partner, we're going to get slapped with tariffs arbitrarily at a moment's notice. Maybe a more resilient strategy is working with Japan and Australia and Ireland and the UK.
Yeah, it is tricky, and I'll be careful as a sort of government employee what I say. New Zealand does have to walk a fine line. I think it's done a really good job. Like you say, China is our biggest trading partner, but we're obviously clearly very Western aligned. I think of it as sort of as the opportunity, I think is, and this is one area where I've sort of, you're right. We've New Zealanders have generally, startups at least, have gone Australia, US, historically. The US is kind of like the primary market, but we've seen success in other places. Tradeify, for example, spent a lot of time went to the UK and then was going to France, and we've seen that sort of UK Ireland sort of pathway expand. What we haven't seen really is much into Asia, and I don't know why. There's huge markets over there. We've now got a free trade agreement with India. 1.45 billion. Huge markets, and largely English speaking, and very entrepreneurial. I've spent a lot of time in India. It's a great place, and I think we have a lot of similarities and huge, like I said, huge markets. And then, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And then you've got, Indonesia and Philippines and huge markets that we could be selling into, but we always go straight to the US. Yes, the prize of the US is, very wealthy individuals and big markets, but it's not easy either. The US is every state and every city is slightly different as well. But at the same time, you've got capital and talent. So it's a balance of sort of where is the right place for you. And I don't think there is a single right answer. And it is, I think especially when you've got countries with different languages, maybe it is a little bit trickier to sort of go there. But I think there's huge untapped opportunities there.
But do you think we're going to see? Yeah. Do you think we're going to see different strategies adopted by startups in this new world order?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's every sort of challenge is an opportunity, and that's what our founders are fantastic at navigating. And I do hope, we see this as an opportunity to enter into new markets and give new markets a try. I think it's going to be interesting. I think especially Europe and how that sort of plays off. And then, the other side of this geopolitical argument is the, whole sort of dual use defense piece as well, which is something obviously we're having to look into. Mindsets are shifting a lot in that space.
There might, just to double click on this, there might be an opportunity even for countries like New Zealand, because before we had globalization and tech, that would create like winner take all markets, and there would only be one cloud provider that's really big, and one defense company that's really big, and one rocket launch company that's really big. But perhaps now in this new world, there needs to be a few alternatives. Do you think New Zealand can play a role in that?
Absolutely. Yeah. You look at, was Operation Spiderweb in Ukraine, and, you've got cheap drones wiping out multi-million-dollar airplanes and things. So, and you've got, I can't remember the name of it, but startups, multi-billion-dollar startups, and in the US now, sort of trying to disrupt these big prime industries. Technology is hugely disruptive in military warfare, but there's huge beasts of machinery sort of behind the incumbents as well. It seems like a small country like New Zealand, there's no reason why it couldn't be producing cheap disruptive warfare. And also we've got companies sort of working on things like cybersecurity as well. So, I'm sure you guys are familiar with Crichton, trying to build secure operating systems, which on the defense side as well as the sort of military sides.
Yeah. Well, that's a good. That's a great kind of like, I think, point you raise, because I think New Zealand is sort of, I think, the only, I don't know, I think this is the only country where I heard some city where there's a lot of kind of protests, and there's a big kind of public policy stance around not hosting U.S. nuclear submarines back in the 70s or something. Where kind of Kiwis are very proud of that kind of perception and what that means and what that says about them. And we've heard from a lot of our founders who are working in deep tech and hardware that could be dual use. They are, I think, at a first pass, very hesitant to work with defense or to go into defense or to work with American defense companies. But I think, and I think Rocket Lab initially, had to make that choice. Initially, they weren't wanted to do that either. Eventually they made that choice. And I think they're now one of their biggest customers, the US government for satellite launch. Yeah. What do you think about that? I mean, do you guys as a fund have restrictions on companies that are in defense? I remember when we were applying or getting the certification for AIP, for example, I think we had to certify that we don't invest in companies that, I don't remember exact language, but it was something like, they couldn't be kind of defense related, or they couldn't be offensive capabilities or something. So there's definitely, I think, a position in the government that makes that sort of off limits. Whereas it feels like now that's actually a very interesting opportunity, not only from a financial point of view, but also from a strategic point of view of New Zealand having its own industry to eventually, if in the worst case, defend itself.
Yeah, it is a live topic. We are literally, in the next couple of weeks, sort of taking to the board some thoughts around how do we evolve our policies on this. Yes, the geopolitical landscape's changing. Yes, warfare's changing. We've talked about sort of disruptive technologies and drones and things like that, but also, the way civilian infrastructure is being challenged as well and attacked. So, and cybersecurity on top of that. There's all sorts of different ways, and it becomes even more broad. Currently, our policy is sort of restricted to indiscriminate weapons, things like cluster bombs and weapons that are, things that are actual weapons that are going to harm civilians, mines or those kind of things. But we had on top of that, we have a sort of a general consensus that we don't really do military at a stage without it being a hard and fast rule. So we have to navigate that quite carefully. And obviously our main concern is damaging the reputation of New Zealand. So we're very mindful of that. But as you say, like, mindsets globally are shifting. It's literally sort of month by month at this stage that we've gone from, over the last sort of until 3 years ago, a massive drop off for years in terms of defense spending globally. And now it seems to be all reversing over the next 10 years.
I mean, yeah, like we've seen it in Europe, right? Like beginning of the Ukraine war, suddenly the mainstream politics shifted from being super pacifist to we need to invest massively into defense.
Yeah.
And I think like in this market in Australia and New Zealand, I think that discussion is just ongoing. It's not as imminent as in Europe because we don't have kind of Russia at the gates here. But,
yes, yeah.
But it's definitely a discussion that, we've seen also with like super funds and all of other kind of IPs that are getting more and more interested in that topic.
Yeah. And it gets tricky as well when you've got, especially a startup who, they'll pivot from left to right, and you sort of, what wasn't a defense company becomes a defense company. Could be anyway. So, or whether it's a small part of their.
Yeah. That's right. Or they could pivot it to be an AI company.
Yeah.
You never know.
Even if like when we started investing in this market, I think the general consensus was like, okay, an exit to the US would be a really good outcome for a startup from New Zealand. Now with the kind of fragmentation that we're talking about, do you think it's desirable over the next few years to try and keep companies more in New Zealand? Even, like having more growth capital, potentially that's something the government should also play a role in, or trying to attract more growth capital so that the HQs are actually staying in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think there's a balance, because the reality is in the short term and probably the long term, there is more capital and there is more talent overseas. That said, the longer we can keep companies in New Zealand, obviously the more talent develops, the more capital appreciation there is by those investors, and therefore when it's recycled, there's more money to flow into the next generation of startups. Obviously, we want to keep as much of that as possible. We'll keep companies here as long as possible. But as long as it's not at the detriment to them getting that expansion and be able to compete globally. I think what I've seen as well work really well is we've seen companies successfully sort of keep their sort of research and development arms in New Zealand, but expand their market expansion overseas. And I think that works really well, because we get to keep a lot of that retained talent and and those are the kind of people that will then go off and spin off the next generation of companies as well. So I love that sort of combination of being able to do both at the same time. But yeah, there's no sort of easy answer on that one.
Yeah. How do you think about, one of the things that we find in our fund specifically, but also I think our startups find that as well, is finding great talent. A lot of times talent in New Zealand is generally cheaper than places like Australia and the US. So that helps with the burn, but finding the best of the best is often hard, both because it's a small market, but also because oftentimes they leave and they go to other places where they get paid better, et cetera. How do you think about that? That is sort of, at least I think for the next 5-10 years, humans will still be required for a lot of the work. and before AI takes over, given New Zealand's sort of reputation and sort of market dynamics of just paying lower salaries just generally, right, than Australia and the US, beyond just funding companies with more money, do you think there's strategies, I don't know, that you as an organization or maybe the government or I don't know, or maybe startups themselves or the funds can undertake to either develop talent or bring talent from overseas? How do you think about that piece?
Yeah, it's probably all of the above. I think there is a lack of talent, especially because we haven't had a lot of companies that have scaled globally. There just aren't people who have the experience in New Zealand who have done that. It's great, and this is the great thing. As you get more companies scaling, there's more people to learn from, and more people have done it to recycle into the next companies. So those things will happen. We'll get there eventually, as long as we keep building the ecosystem. At the same time, connectivity with other markets is probably easier than it's ever been. So getting access to people, locally who have done this before or internationally, Australia's just on our doorstep. It's a 3-hour flight away and a very easy phone call. US, West Coast is 3-hour time zone different. We can pick up the phone to people and download some of these skills and talk to people. There was a survey done a couple of years ago by Startup Genome, which looks at startup ecosystems globally. New Zealanders are great at talking to people. We are terrible at asking for help. And that's the one thing we need to shift. So yes, we can make the introductions and connections, but we actually then don't do the follow through and ask for help. And I've seen it time again. So I think, and then on top of that, yes, we need to be thinking about our education system or in terms of building skills for the future. Unfortunately, those kind of things take time, but we should be, as a nation, thinking about what are the skills we're going to need, how we're going to, if we grow the tech sector and create all these jobs, there's huge sort of workforce changes that are going to be needed and great opportunities to, these are high paid jobs. And then, yes, on top of that, we do need to pay more. We want globally competitive people. We need to pay globally competitive salaries. The other sort of weird anomaly with that as well is that because we haven't had enough success, a lot of New Zealanders don't realize how valuable ESOPs are and share options are, because they haven't seen, like if you're in Silicon Valley, you've seen your friends become millionaires. I think Rocket Lab's created 150 millionaires now. So once you start seeing the value of those, then we can start bringing more people. You don't need to be paying them high salaries. You can reward them in shares and options and things like that as well, which then also sort of brings up. There's also huge pools of talent sitting in corporates around the country and in all sorts of industries that we are and huge swathes of the economy. I'm absolutely sure we have the raw capability. We just haven't given people the opportunities and training.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about the challenges, I guess, for New Zealand, but you also spend a lot of time overseas kind of pitching New Zealand, right? And talking about how great it is to build startups here. How do you pitch New Zealand as a place to build the next technology companies?
It's really the ideas. I think, and again, we hear feedback from Asia that we've got all the capital, but we don't have as many sort of ideas as you seem to have in New Zealand. And so we're great at generating ideas and generating the companies. We have this mindset of, I'm going to just, why has everyone tried it this way? Why has no one done it this way before? We can create rocket labs, in New Zealand to split the atom. We are now working on nuclear fusion. We are doing huge things. So we have the ability. It's a great place to live. It's a great place to work. We've all emigrated here because it's a beautiful country and a beautiful place to live. And I think we've seen a lot of investors and startups have similar sort of journeys. So you can, and I think, there is a talent here. It's probably not as visible or as easy to get hold of in America as it is in America or overseas. But so we have all the raw ingredients, and it's just the people are great, and it's a great place to live. So why not do both?
No, I would just add, I think the other case that we always make to our LPs is also, it's still a nascent emerging market compared to the US, right? So there's so much more opportunity to have an impact and get involved in the early stages rather than kind of elbowing your way into the market. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, I was wondering, imagine 20, 30 years down the line, you did everything that you wanted to do and you helped grow the New Zealand ecosystem, and you created large pools of capital, a very mature VC ecosystem, thousands of startups per year. One kind of, repercussion or kind of unintended, maybe intended, maybe unintended effect is the divergence of wealth that would create that you see in places like Silicon Valley. And just I think the U.S. as a whole, right? Where I think if you obviously own a large share of a company, and like the company becomes a category leader, you just by definition sort of become very wealthy. And New Zealand's a very egalitarian place in a lot of ways. How do you think that would change the culture if everything that you kind of want, comes to pass?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. I'm not sure we have seen that yet with some of the successful, I won't name names, but I guess I see it more as the opportunity. Like you look at sort of people, what high paid tech jobs can do for whole families, not just individuals. And I think sort of there is actually a growing inequality in New Zealand already. And I know we like to call ourselves egalitarian, but the reality is there is definitely already that sort of having, property owners versus non-property owners. And we know the house purchase prices have been they're getting slightly better, but they have been very unaffordable. So I see it more as an opportunity for sort of bringing everybody up, and I think creating tech jobs. And the reality as well is we do what we want to do collectively for this ecosystem. The economic impact for New Zealand is lots, tens of thousands more high paid jobs. It means more tax being generated, which means we can build the hospitals and we can build the schooling and education systems we want. It's all that sort of the other public benefit to New Zealand. And then it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of we keep expanding and hopefully building everybody up and having all the wonderful sort of infrastructure that we all want as a nation.
We slightly adjacent question to that, like what kind of policy do you think could be really impactful in New Zealand that's not necessarily tech related? If you could change anything like tax structure or immigration or whatever it is, like what do you think is like has such a big impact on tech that you'd like to see a change?
Yeah, I think opening up of immigration policies to allow more tech, and we've talked about talent and availability of talent, making it easy to attract talent that is hard to come by. I also think some kind of incentive to get people investing less in property and investing in the tech sector. I think that would be huge, and similar, whether it's KiwiSavers or individuals, having some incentive to get people investing in the space. Because then we've got, like I said, we've got the raw ingredients, we've got the capability to build. So if we can put some more capital into the flywheel, that will make a huge difference. And then I think sort of the other side of it, which I think is well underway, is a sort of partnerships with overseas jurisdictions and just sort of building those. And that doesn't need to be government. That's each of us individually. There's huge, like I said, the Australian market sitting on our doorstep. They're very collaborative. We can work really closely with them and build the sort of Asia Pacific market up that way, and Southeast Asia as well, similarly. So I think there's greater collaboration and sort of partnerships globally will help.
Maybe one more kind of more personal question. I mean, you've invested in a lot of different capacities yourself. You've dealt with a lot of very interesting people who are all creating and pushing the boundaries in some way, whether it's entrepreneurs or filmmakers or fund managers. What insights has that given you into the types of personalities that drive the world and innovation forward? Are there certain commonalities and traits that those people share, or do you think everyone's sort of different and different traits are well suited for different environments?
Everyone's different, obviously. Yeah, very. That's, I guess, a bit of a trite answer, but I'd say there's neurodiversity is probably a sort of commonality across a lot of the areas, especially in sort of startup founders and so on. And it's really, ambition and sort of purpose, I think, are the sort of key drivers we look for. I get very nervous when I ask someone why they're doing something, and it's about making money or becoming a millionaire or whatever. What is the impact you want to have? What is the why, personal why you're doing it is a huge determinant on whether people will be successful. We all know whatever you're doing, your career will be difficult and there will be setbacks. And it's having that sort of personal why and ambition which will drive you through when times get hard.
What is your why?
Legacy and impact, really. It is like I genuinely I fell in love with New Zealand pretty much the day I arrived, and I wanted to help New Zealand be better. I love tech, I love gadgets, and the two sort of came together. And like I said, sort of 6.5 years ago, I found out about a job at NZGCP to come and set up Elevate, and I was like, wow, that's like serendipity. I can have an impact, and that's all I want. I want us to be able to look back in 10, 20 years time and say, yep, we played a part. We're not going to do it all on our own. We need everybody to sort of work with. And I love that. I love sort of partnering with people. And there's so many people in New Zealand that are sort of passionate about this. And we can get us all working together. I think we can do it. I know we can. It's going to take a bit of perseverance.
That's awesome. I love that. That's great. Thank you, James. Yeah, maybe we do a quick fire. What is the one sector in New Zealand that is overhyped right now?
AgTech.
What is the one sector? What is the one sector that is criminally underfunded?
Medical devices.
True or false? New Zealand will have a nuclear fusion power plant before we fix Auckland traffic.
True.
Biggest mistake New Zealand founders make when pitching international investors.
Underselling themselves in the opportunity.
Awesome. Great. Well,
Yeah, thanks, James. This was really great. I think we have a lot of entrepreneurs from New Zealand listening to this very early stage. Any kind of last pieces of advice that you'd give to people who are trying to build big tech companies from New Zealand?
No, I mean, just be ambitious. Yeah, I think we don't undersell yourself. We have a history of doing amazing things. I'm sure your ideas are amazing. Go out and talk to people, ask those questions, ask for help. Don't just have a coffee and get to know someone. Actually reach out and ask for help. Reach out to us, to you guys as well. Like, just don't undersell yourself and just, think big.
Perfect.
Awesome.
That sounds great. Well, thanks so much. This was really cool. Thanks, James.
All right. Thanks a lot. You enjoyed that.
thank you for tuning in to TechMates. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with friends. We'll be back soon with more stories of Kiwi and Aussie founders reshaping the future and disrupting down under. Until next time, keep dreaming big and daring to disrupt.